So before we go into analyzing the end of the story, let's look over again a quick summary of what we saw happen at the end of the novel. And of course, this is the culmination, the end of our action in the story. And so we find out, right, not only what happens, right? So Manlius makes the alliance with Gundobad and rescues his lands from the threat of the barbarians. Olivier, we know he is attacked, but in return he saves the Jews and particularly his two friends. Julien, well, he loses Julia and he kills himself. Right? So we know not only what happens, but now we also have an insight into things that we didn't at the beginning, and even in probably even our last reading, we didn't know why the characters did this. Why did Julien kill himself? Right? For example, why did Olivier betray Gichani? Right? Those things are answered for us now that we know what has happened. Okay, so let's quickly step through these parts of the plot. So remember last time we left off with Julien going to the high school that had been transformed into a prison to get Julia and to release her, but he finds that she's already been shipped off to the railway station. So he goes to the railway station, but he also finds that he's too late there as well. Right? Julia has already been taken off, we assume, to a concentration camp, and even though like the official line is that she's just there to work until the end of the war, right? Everyone knows really that it's a death camp, right? She'll die there. And he goes to see Marcel. He's like, what the hell, Marcel, we had a deal, right? You were supposed to release Julia and I would give you Bernard in return. And Marcel says, sorry, it's someone above me. I can't do anything about it. I can't save her. And then Julien, instead of just like storming off, he gives a very interesting speech where he talks about his own feelings and his own experiences, where he says, look, when I was a soldier in World War I saw the terrible things that were happening when civilization was collapsing, and I thought that like I had to save civilization from the barbarians, from barbarity. And then he turns around and says, but actually I see that there's more evil potential even in civilization. And he says the Holocaust, the killing of the Jews, he says is for him, as he interprets it, right, is for him the culmination of civilization. You had to have theologians and philosophers and academics to justify it. You had to have politicians. You had to have science. You had to have technology, right? All these things that took hundreds of years to allow this horrible event to happen. It can't be just an accident that this happened, he says, right? Civilization had been preparing to kill off a bunch of people that was different to it from the very beginning. At the end of that section, Marcel goes off to church to pray, remembering that he's a devout Catholic, and Julien's sort of like, oh, I wish I could do that, but he's not, he doesn't believe. All right, we then see Manlius, who meets with his friend Felix, and they try to reconcile, right? But Felix is pretty angry with Manlius, and he sort of says, well, I don't know if our friendship will be able to continue even with after this alliance. We then see that Olivier gets a document from the Pope saying that Gersonides and Rebecca are to be released. So he gets them out of prison and tells them to leave town. And at the end of that section, Gersonides says, well, that document, The Dream of Scipio by Manlius, says that our intentions, our contemplation, what we think, is more important than our actions. And Gersonides says, I think that's wrong. So remember, this is something we talked about last time, right? Your intentions can be good, but you can end up with a bad outcome. You can have bad intentions, and you can still end up with a good outcome. Which one? How do we judge a person's actions, right? Even our own actions, sometimes in that context. So Julien goes back to his house, and he knows that Marcel has a guard outside, like watching him, right, secretly. So he eats a last meal, and this is something we've seen several times in the book, right? So there's this last supper, symbolic last supper, and he slips past the guard with a bit of help from his friend, and then he goes back to his family home at Roe. Remember, this is where he was staying with Julia. Okay. Now, Bernard isn't supposed to meet Julien until the afternoon. So in the morning, Julien decides that he'll go and he'll visit the shrine of Saint Sophia. And while he's there, he realizes, and remembering in the paintings, right? Remember the myth about like Saint Sophia coming, and she does what to the fake Manlius in the story? Cures him of what? Blindness, right? And so blindness is often used by poets, painters, etc., as a symbol not of literal blindness, but of being unable to actually see what's in front of us, right? Being blind to the truth or to reality. Okay? So as we saw, Manlius actually isn't blind, is he? But he is blind to Sophia's teaching. Right? So in this case, Julien has a similar kind of realization, right? He realizes that he also has been blind to many of the truths that he had assumed about life and about civilization and about Julia and all sorts of things that he hadn't really understood, but that Julia had, right? He realizes this. Felix then leaves the house of Manlius after their meeting, and he gets a little while away, and then he's attacked. Right? He and his men are attacked, and he is killed. But before he's killed, he recognizes one of the attackers, and he realizes, oh, yeah, this guy was at Manlius's house. Manlius was the one that sent these guys to kill me. Right? So remembering there's a parallel here between, remember, the German driver who like stops in town, asks the directions, and he drives on, and then like once he gets out of town, he's killed, right? There's a parallel in the story here to what happens to Felix. Okay, we then see that Gundobad, King Gundobad, the barbarian king, successfully takes over the region. Manlius works hard for him to keep the peace, even though the prosperity of the region keeps on declining. And we learned that he feels kind of sad for the rest of his life because he also loses, not Sophia, I should correct that, Sophia, and because their friendship has ended. We haven't learned just yet why. We do now. And so we jump to the conversation that ends their friendship. Right? And Sophia tells him that the things that he has done in making the alliance with Gundobad, not so much that, or becoming the bishop, but some of the cruel things that he has done, killing Syagrius, persecuting the Jews, right? Those things, she says, mean that he hasn't really understood what she was saying, what her message was. And so because of that, right? Because of that, Sophia says, people like you, politicians, you just use me as a justification for your own selfish, ruthless actions. Right? And so she says, we're not friends anymore. I don't want to see you anymore. And so she goes off and lives her life of contemplation. Olivier, then he goes and he sees one of the Comte de Fréjus men, right? And remembering that he needs to be attacked, right? Now, in normal circumstances, like he could have like tried to escape like Rebecca and Gersonides do. But he knows, right, that if he is not attacked, then the Pope is going to take back his command to protect the Jews, right? So if Olivier isn't attacked, then his friends and also the rest of the Jews will be in deep trouble, right, will be killed. So Olivier knows that he needs to be attacked. So he sees one of the Comte de Fréjus men and says, "Hey, here I am, come get me," right? And then he goes, well, not quite like that, but it's sort of like that, you know. He's sort of like, they're all expecting him to be hiding, and yet he goes and says, "Look, I'll be over there. Come get me when you're ready." So he then goes back to Pisano's house, right, remembering that Pisano has already gone and died. And there he writes his final poems, right? Some of the poems that Julien has been reading. And 4 hours later, the Comte de Fréjus men come along. They torture him. They smash his hands so that he can't write anymore. They cut out his tongue so he can't speak anymore, right? And we see the aftermath of the things that we've already learned about earlier. Ciccani, his plan is discovered, right? He falls from grace, and the Pope Clement, issues his command to protect the Jews, right? Okay. So now we see the full picture of what happens to Olivier and also why it happens, right? He does this to save his friends. We then see that for the end of his life, the next few months, Olivier goes to a monastery, and he lives there. Rebecca comes to visit him. She says, like, "You shouldn't have done this. Why did you do it?" And she confirms for us what I hinted at earlier, right, which is that her parents were the same heretics that Altier was talking about when he was talking to Olivier earlier in the novel, right? The heretics who were put on trial and the judge was the current Pope, right? So Olivier, he eventually dies of his injuries, right? Dies of being attacked after several months, right? But nonetheless, we're told that he is completely happy. He has Rebecca with him. He got what he wanted. He can't write anymore. He can't communicate anymore, but he's happy when he dies. We then see we're essentially jumping back to the opening of the novel for its closure. And we see that Julien, he walks back to his house, makes a big pile of all his papers, has a last cigarette from his pack, and then he takes some kerosene and also some alcohol, a bottle of alcohol that Elizabeth had given to him, and he puts it all over the papers, and he sets them on fire, and of course in so doing, he also allows himself to die in the fire that consumes his house. Okay. And then finally, this is a remember we saw when Claude Bronson died, we had the very long, elaborate scene of the Last Supper and all the speeches to civilization, and then at the end of that, we had a very short part. You know, Claude Bronson, taken away to a labor camp, dies, right? This is a deliberate strategy, right, on Ian Pears's part, where we have a long explanation of things, but then the actual conclusion, the shocking conclusion of death, comes very quickly and is told in a very short, terse kind of way. So Bernard, he sees the fire, right? He sees Julien's fire, and he's like, "Oh, maybe I should stay away." Right? So he stays away when he sees the fire. He lives in, you know, the surrounding, you know, area for another 6 weeks, but then he's captured and he's killed. And we're also told that the 26 people who were rounded up as revenge for the killing of the German driver, they are also executed 2 days later. And that's where the novel finishes. Right. Okay, so what I want to talk about today as our final sort of topic is to consider about some of the more subtle nuances, the subtle ironies that Ian Pears builds into the ending of these three characters, into the conclusion of what happens to these three characters. Right? Because of course we've seen, and I gave you a very, very quick outline and now a slower outline of what happens to those characters. Right? We know their endings now. We know why they did what they did. But there are also some more, as I said, some more subtle, some more carefully hidden layers that if you are not reading as closely as we are, of course we're reading this very closely, we're going through the novel slowly and picking up as many bits of meaning as we can, then it's easy to miss some of these things about the conclusion of these characters. Okay? So I've titled this as like there are certain ironies, certain things that like are sort of contradictions, subtle contradictions about the way in which these characters end. Okay. So I'm going to go through each of the three main characters, Manlius, Olivier, and Julien, and I'm going to look at the way in which there is a little more, if we dig a little deeper, and if we can think a little bit more, and we make a few more connections, we can see the way in which their ending is even more complicated than it would appear when we first finish reading this. Okay. Now, I should also tell you, I've read this novel, I actually can't remember, maybe 5 or 6 times, right? And so, of course, when you read a novel that many times, and also when you read a complicated novel like this one, your ideas also change and evolve, right? Because you go back and you see like characters and situations in a new light, right? Because you know what's going to happen and you know what is coming later on. Very similar to what I said about Atonement, right? Is that when you read Atonement for a second time and you know that, you know, Bryony is the narrator and you know that, you know, various other things are going to happen, it changes the way in which you read the novel. Well, so too, my view of these characters has changed as I have read this novel. So particularly, I think the character that for me has changed the most is actually that of Manlius, right? Where I initially, when the first couple of times I read this, I judged him quite harshly, right? And I said, that Manlius, he's obviously the worst character, right? Obviously, he's the bad character that we should all condemn, and he did the wrong thing, and Sophia turns against him, and right? But the more I read this novel, the more I think, oh, it's more complicated than that. Okay, so we see that Manlius raises this question that we looked at last time, that question of what our intentions are, right? What we're thinking about, right? How we approach a situation, and he calls this, in this case, he calls it contemplation, right? Our thoughts about a situation. So at various other times, he refers to it as understanding. We could refer to it sometimes as intention, but basically it's what our thoughts are about a situation, what we're thinking is going to happen, what we think we're going to do, how we understand what is happening in a situation, as opposed to the actual outcome in reality, the actions that we do. Okay? So remember that in the dream, in his manuscript of The Dream of Scipio, Manlius argues that we have to start with rational contemplation, right? We have to think things through in our minds, and then we have to put that into action, right? And that's how we come up with the best way of approaching a situation, right? And therefore, he says, like, it doesn't, in the end, it ultimately doesn't matter what your actions are, it matters what you were thinking, right? How you thought about the situation, right? So we see that in Gersonides' view, right? Gersonides' view, when he talks to Olivier about this idea, Gersonides, as we see, he tells him that it's wrong. So this is in our reading from page 211 in your course packet. It says, Olivier took a deep breath, then turned and bowed in farewell. Gersonides nodded in return, then thought of something. the manuscript you brought me by that bishop, it argues that understanding is more important than movement or action, right? It means here. That action is virtuous only if it reflects pure comprehension, pure understanding. And that virtue comes from the comprehension, the understanding, not the action, right? So here we see him, he summarizes Manlius. What's in our mind, what we're thinking matters, according to Manlius, more than what our actions are, right? What the outcome is. Okay. And we see, Olivier frowned. So, dear boy, I must tell you a secret. What? I do believe it is wrong. Right? So here, Gersonides disagrees with that argument in Manlius's manuscript of the Dreamer's Cave. He says, no, I think the outcome, our actions are more important than what we're thinking. Right? So he reverses that. Now, we saw last time this is a very complicated kind of question because we can look at someone like Clement and we can see that he definitely has not got good contemplation. He's not a nice thinker. He's not a nice guy. He's not doing this out of any sort of virtuous or merciful purpose of protecting the Jews. But nonetheless, he does produce a good outcome. Okay. Now, the thing I want you to think about, though, is, in this particular case, is Sophia's reaction to Manlius after she learns of the things that he does, particularly killing Syagrius and also of persecuting the Jews. In this case, she says the reason that she is ending their friendship is not because of Manlius's contemplation. There's nothing wrong with that. You're pretty good at philosophy, unlike Syagrius. But the reason I'm ending our friendship is because of your actions, right? So here we have a kind of contradiction, right? Because Sophia has taught Manlius these things. She's taught him contemplation is more important than action. And yet, when it comes down to it, she actually says, well, I'm ending our friendship because of your action, not because of your thoughts. Okay. So as I said, the character of Manlius is one of those ones that as I've reread this novel and reread this novel and reread this novel, I've come back to and rethought about, like, what is his position? What is his, like, how do you judge him? And you can't separate that in a way from what you think of Sophia, right? And obviously, for the most part in the novel, she is a very sort of sympathetic and admirable character, right? She's tough, she is independent, she thinks for herself, right? And we see, of course, this is particularly difficult as a female philosopher in her time, let alone just being a philosopher in general, right? But as I read this novel again and again, I feel that there's something hypocritical in the way in which she approaches Manlius in this case. Because when we look at Manlius and what Manlius does, right? As I said, there's the other evil thing that he does is kill Felix. So kills Syagrius, persecutes the Jews, kills his best friend Felix, right? But when we look at what Manlius does, there's never this sense that he is just being sort of, just ruthless for the sake of it, or that he is just trying to justify his actions, right? Instead, we see that he does seem to really be earnest and honest in trying to, like, follow through the ideas of Sophia, right? Of trying to be a good leader, of trying to make the right decisions, right? And so he actually does, as far as I can see, he does actually follow through what Sophia says exactly, right? So Sophia's words do lead him, as well as to lead him to being the bishop and to taking leadership and making the alliance with Gundobad. They also, in many ways, lead him also to these other rather less glorious, rather less than virtuous acts as well. So while Sophia, in her argument with Manlius, while she makes some good general points, right? She says politicians twist the words and ideas of philosophers to justify their own actions. It's basically her argument. But I also get the sense that she is not facing up to the full consequences of her own teachings and her own philosophy. Right? So, as it says here, while Sophia is rightly horrified by what Manlius has done, she's unable to face up to the fact that her philosophy, her ideas, led him to do these things. Right? And so this is where I think why, even though Sophia is an admirable character, she lacks something in terms of real world experience. Right? She's able to be really tough and really rigorous and uncompromising when it comes to debating students with abstract ideas and things that are theoretical. Right? She's able to be as tough as anything there. But it's much more complicated, just as we saw in Atonement. It's easy for Bryony to be tough on her characters in her stories in Atonement. Right? But when she's a nurse and she's faced with, dying patients and, people who have been wounded and, the realities of life, oh, that's much more complicated, much harder to deal with, right? So I always think of this kind of division when I teach. I used to teach world literature classes, and we would read Goethe's Faust, right? And Faust is the story of the guy who sells his soul or who makes a bet with the devil that the devil will take his soul, right, if he loses the bet. And I remember one of the questions that I would put on the homework sheets for my students is I'd tell them, would you make the deal with the devil? Would you? And all the students would always say, oh, no, I would never. I'm too smart for that. I would never, ever do something like Faust, right? Now, it's easy to say that in a classroom. It's easy to say that in your homework, isn't it? Right? But when you're placed in an actual real-life difficult situation, things become a lot more complicated, don't they, when they're in actual real life, in practical real-life situations compared to in a theoretical, abstract situation where you are judging something from the outside, right? And so this is where I think it's much more complicated than it initially appears, right? So actually, over time, I've come to sympathize a little with Manlius. I don't think that he did, obviously, I don't think that he did the right thing by killing his son, persecuting the Jews, and killing his friend Felix, right? He did the wrong thing in those cases, right? But at the same time, we have to sympathize with him insofar as he faces a really tough set of circumstances, right? And so he has to make some really difficult decisions that Sophia, well, with her life of contemplation, yeah, she also goes through some difficult things, but ultimately she doesn't really face the full reality of putting those into practice. So those are some more abstract, difficult kinds of questions. A second irony about the conclusion or ending of these characters happens particularly with Rebecca, right, in Olivier's storyline. And I've hinted at this before, and I mentioned it in the summary today, which is that we learn about her parents, right? Remembering that her parents were Cathar heretics, and remembering that the Cathars had been oppressed, severely oppressed by the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 1200s, so this is more than 100 years later, right? And so they're sort of arrested and put to death by the previous pope. Okay. Now, last time we talked in quite a bit of depth about Clement and how there is a sort of contradiction between the things that he does in protecting the Jews and his actual intentions, which are, as we see, are not good, right? His intentions merely are to use them for his own political ends, right? So if it's good for Chichani to persecute the Jews, then in this case it turns out to be good for Clement to undermine Chichani by protecting the Jews. Right? Now, the revelation that we get at the end, the confirmation that we get at the end, that Rebecca and her parents, or Rebecca's parents, were killed at the order of Pope Clement before he was Pope, when he was Pierre Roger, right, is a particularly interesting one, right? Because we see, why is Rebecca in this situation in the first place? Why is she Gersonity's servant? Why is she wrongly identified as a Jew? Well, we see it's because her parents were killed. By whom were they killed? By the now Pope Clement, right? So he puts her into this situation, right? He's the one that creates this, this life situation for Rebecca, right? He doesn't know that he's done it, of course. He has no idea who Rebecca is. She's just a sort of a side effect of his earlier life as a cardinal, right? So nonetheless, he is responsible for where Rebecca is right now. Now, then his decree that she should be released from prison and that the Jews should be protected comes from, who orders this? Pope Clement, right? So there's a deliberate irony that is built into the narrative, right? Which is that Pope Clement, before he's Pope, he's the one that creates this problem, this life situation for Rebecca, right? He puts her into the situation where we first meet her, that she's a Jew, that she's living with Gersonides, her parents are being killed, right? All those things. That's caused, in some ways, by Pope Clement. So even though he's the one that ultimately, at the end, as it were, rescues her through, of course, Olivier's agency, right? Despite that, he's also the one that has created this. So there's a very ambiguous tone here because, of course, we can see in a way, he's the savior of the situation, right? He protects the Jews, he helps Rebecca, but he's also the one that put her in the situation in the first place, right? So there's certain irony to that. Okay, lastly, the last one and the most complicated one is that, remember when we see Julien in that second last section of the novel, when he sets himself on fire, right? He uses his books and his papers as fuel for the fire, but also to really get the fire started, he uses some flammable liquids. Kerosene, right? Sort of byproduct of petroleum, and what else? This thing, a bottle of eau de vie given to him by Elizabeth, right? Okay, so this carries with it a great deal of important symbolism. Okay, so what is eau de vie? Well, all of you may have drunk it at some point, but it is a kind of alcohol that is distilled from fruit, right? So think of something like schnapps, German schnapps, right? It's like liqueur that's distilled from fruit, right? Has a very sweet, fruity sort of flavor, right? Okay, so that's what eau de vie is, okay? But there are a number of overlapping bits of symbolism that are drawn from this particular gesture of Julien's. First of all, when we were thinking before about intention versus outcome, right? And one of the metaphors that is commonly used for outcome, for the results of something, is its fruit, right? The produce, what something produces, the fruit of our actions, for example, right? Is a metaphor referring to what we do with our actions, what we do with ourselves, what we choose to do. So one of the most famous quotations about this idea, for example, right, is from the Bible when Jesus is talking about how you can judge people, right? How you can think about someone's actions, how you can think about whether something is good or bad. And in this case, he says, "Ye shall know them by their fruits," right? So not because someone will come along and say, "Oh, Tongman, here's an apple. Do you like it?" No, it's not judging by like the actual fruits that they give you or any of the fruits that they grow in the garden, but like their actions is what he's talking about, right? You shall judge them by their actions. What they do is how you will know them. So, to go on with the quote from Matthew there. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. Right? Now, of course, continuing the metaphor, the tree means, in this case, people. Right? Just like a good tree brings forth good fruit, a bad tree produces bad fruit, so too good people do good things. Bad people do bad things, and you can tell whether someone is good or bad by their actions. That's what he's saying here. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Right? Notice that? Into the fire. How does Julian die? In a fire. Right? Good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. That bringeth not good fruit is cast down and thrown into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. Right? So this famous quotation from the Bible, right, gives us a clue here, right? That this is, right, the eau de vie is made from fruit, right? And then fruit in turn is a common metaphor for what someone's actions are, right? It shows their behavior, shows their character, shows who they are by their actions. So, what is the message that we're being given here? Well, Julien, at least this is his decision, he decides that when judging, that the outcome, when you're judging someone's actions, is what matters. Not the motivation, not their intention, not contemplation, not any of those things that Manlius decides is more important, but the outcome. Right? Now, remember too, we've seen that Julien, all the way through, he has always acted just like with Manlius, but I think even more so in Julien's case, he's always acted with the best of intentions. Right? He's always wanted to have the best outcome. Right? So even when he collaborates with Marcel, right, he doesn't collaborate just for his own self-interest. Right? He collaborates because he wants to help people. He wants to preserve civilization. He wants to preserve learning. Right? He's doing this for other people and to preserve other things, rather than just being his own selfish, like for his own selfish ends. Right. There are four different ways we can interpret this. The second second level of symbolism comes from the fact that the eau de vie, right, this kind of liqueur, is quite visibly a product of civilization, right? Something that you need, like technology, and you need like sophisticated means to produce it. And so as a product of civilization, it sort of stands in here for civilization itself. Right? We've seen from the Last Supper that Claude Bronson holds, civilization can produce many great things, but we also see in Julien's speech to Marcel that eclipsing all of those great things that civilization, or poisoning or ruining all those great things that civilization has produced, is also the terrible things that it has done, right? So in this case, Julian decides that the murder of the Jews, the genocide of the Jews by the Nazis, completely overwhelms the great achievements, right? And so for him, the mass murder of the Jews, the killing of the Jews is, as it were, that's the fruit of civilization. That's its outcome. That's what it has produced for Julian. And that's why it should be cut down, thrown into the fire. And you can see that he, as it were, includes himself in this, right? He's like, I also turn out to be a bad guy. I also condemn myself, right? I also should be thrown into the fire because I made a big mistake. Right? Okay, so a third way is, remember that the narrator tells us, and tells us on this page here, the bottle of eau de vie Elizabeth Deveau had once given to Julia. Right? So this was a gift from Elizabeth to Julia, a welcoming present, a gesture of friendship. Were Elizabeth and Julia friends? She pretends to be, doesn't she? Right? She gives her this bottle of eau de vie, this bottle of alcohol. Right? What else does she do that appears to be friendly? Yes, she does. What does she do after that talk? Remember, Elizabeth comes to see Julia when she's painting at the shrine of Saint Sophia. They talk about Julian, they talk about getting married, and at the end, she leaves her this meal, right? And remembering how difficult it is to get good food during the war, and yet the meal that Elizabeth leaves for Julia, remember she says, oh, this is the most amazing meal she had had, in months, right? So Elizabeth does give her these gifts, but as we've seen before, gifts, they're not always as friendly as they appear to be on the surface, are they, right? Gifts contain with them a certain kind of power. Right? And so we see here that Elizabeth's friendship, this gift of friendship of the eau de vie to Julia, is actually not all that friendly. Right? And in many ways, as I said, we can see it as a sort of a parallel to the kiss that Judas gives to Jesus when he betrays him, right? You know, the biblical story, right, is when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane before he is taken away to be put on trial, right? Judas, one of his disciples who's betrayed him, brings along a bunch of Roman soldiers, right? And he tells them, right, the guy I go up and I will kiss him on the cheek, you'll know that's the one that you should arrest, right? So he goes up to Jesus and he kisses him on the cheek, and it appears to be friendly, right? It's a way of greeting him, but at the same time, it's also a way of betraying him. Right? So these are the kinds of false friendships, right? Kind of fake friendships that Julian decides that civilization is built upon, and that allows evil to form at the heart of civilization, right? Because remember too, in the speech that he makes to Marcel, he says, well, I can understand, that you, Marcel, would do some bad things, and I can understand that Bernard would do some bad things, because you guys are ultimately, I've known you all your life, you guys are selfish, you guys are ruthless. I can understand that you were going to do some bad things. But Elizabeth, I always thought she was good. I always thought she was a good person, right? I could not imagine that a good person like that would betray Julia, right? And he's so disillusioned, he's so disappointed by that he comes to this conclusion, right? That Now remember, this is not the ultimate conclusion of Ian Pears. This is the ultimate conclusion of Julian, right? He comes to a very dark, unhappy conclusion about these things. All right, the final way in which we can interpret Julian's death is in relation to a metaphor that we've seen all the way through from both Neoplatonism and from the Cathars. Because in French, the literal meaning of eau de vie, right? So eau de vie we've seen is the term for kind of alcohol distilled from fruit. But its literal meaning, eau means water, de means of, and vie means life. So the water of life. Okay? So we've seen this a number of times pop up in our storyline, and it has always been in relation either to Manlius's Neoplatonism or to the Cathars, right? And it refers back, of course, to this idea. So think of that, for instance, that scene where Olivier, just before he meets Altier, he bumps into the cobbler, and the cobbler offers him some water, right? And Olivier quotes Manlius about the water of life, right? Okay, so in this case, we see that the water of life, that is eau de vie, right? Remember, that was a metaphor used by the Cathars and used by the Neoplatonists to refer to the idea that God or the divine, the oneness, is like the ocean, right? A huge amount of water, all one ocean, but made up of many drops, as it were. Whereas our life here on earth, right, it's like we have our souls, our spirit, is, for the Neoplatonists or Cathars, is a drop of water, right? And it's trapped in our body, this prison, so that when we die, our soul escapes from the body and returns to the divine oneness, right? So there are many drops of water contained in every body, but they get released back to the divine. Okay? So, of course, what we're seeing here is, of course, the death of Julian. So obviously he hasn't thought about it in this way, or at least he doesn't, the narrator doesn't tell us that Julian is thinking in this way. But there is a sort of a parallel here to the teachings of the Cathars. Now, in particular, the Cathars had a tradition of training specific people, right? Certain people. They could be, this particular term, bonhomme, refers specifically to men, because it means good men, right? The Catholics called them parfaits, or perfects, right? And they would go through a rigorous series of sort of denying their body and training, religious and physical training. And their idea was that they were sort of like getting ready, as it were, to remove themselves from the physical world, right? So they were ready to die, right? Not that they were going to commit suicide, right? But that they purified themselves to the point where now, right, they can live out the rest of their lives in this religious way because they have prepared themselves. They're ready to die at any time. Okay. Now, during the persecution of the Cathars in particular, and we saw this with the heretics who were tried by Pierre Roger, right, the future Pope Clement, right? Remember, how were they killed? How did they die? How were they executed? By by Clement, but what was the means by which they did it? Hanging? They were burned at the stake, right? They were burned to death, right? So the Cathars, as we saw in Altier's story, right? He says that like they weren't fearful at all of their death, right? The way they saw it, they're like, well, okay, you can kill us if you want, Fine, our souls will just go back to God. Fine, we don't care. Right? Was how, and that was what was shocking about them to, Pierre Roget, right? So Julien, when he sets himself on fire, he replicates that same kind of idea, right? Is that he is burned alive, he dies by fire in the same way that these earlier Cathars died at the stake, right? Of course, the other bit of symbolism that we have here, and we saw particularly in the early section of the novel when little Julien, young boy Julien, discovers near his parents' place, he discovers the ruins of Manlius's house. And he sees in the mosaic, what's left of the mosaic, he sees a phoenix, right? And remember, the legend of the phoenix, too, is one of death. The body of the phoenix is then burnt, and out of the ashes arises a new phoenix. Right? So it's a symbol of death, fire as a process of purification and refinement, and then rebirth. Right? So that eau de vie, right, we see that there are a whole lot of overlapping ways in which we could interpret. On the one hand, we could see it within the novel's theme of the phoenix and also of the Cathars of being burnt and then rising again as a new idea, right? New person, new thing. Right? And we've seen that kind of idea is not being something that's literal all the way through the novel, but certainly ideas have kept on being revived all the way through, right? So we've seen particularly Manlius's ideas, right, keep getting recycled in new and different ways, by both in good ways, right, and also in bad ways throughout the novel, right? So we see that Olivier uses Manlius's ideas, for example, to argue for the protection of the Jews. We also see that Manlius's ideas are used at various points in history, to persecute the Jews, right? So even though they're the same ideas, we see that they have different outcomes. Similarly, we can see this is kind of a renewal for Julien, or we could see it, if we connect it back to the verse from Matthew in the Bible that I quoted, that also he might see it as being a kind of end, right? That he's like, this is a corrupt world, and I'm a corrupt person, civilization is corrupt, it needs to be destroyed. Right? Now, just one final note on this too. With regard to, remember I said to you, Julien's perspective, and none of the characters' perspectives are ultimately Ian Pears's perspective, right? Remember, this is presented to us within the context of a work of fiction, right? We should never confuse what a character thinks with what the author thinks, right? Rather, what Ian Pears is doing here is he's providing us with a kind of dialogue, right, between these different characters, between these different situations, to get us to think about our own ideas and how we might think through these situations, right? That's what I'm getting you to do, for example, with that second exam question, right? But also one other thing to think about with regard to Julien is that, remember the time when he kills himself, right? We're told, if we go back to the beginning of the book, right? It's August 18, 1943. Right? And who is winning the war at this point? The Germans appear to be winning the war. Right? Now, we know, because we're reading this in 2014, we know that, did the Germans win? No, they didn't. Right? So we have, it's easy for us because we think, oh yeah, come on, Julia, just wait a couple of years, the war will be over, right? I mean, you won't get Julia back, but it won't be the end of civilization, right? But he doesn't know this at this time, right? Even though it's less than 2 years before the end of the war, right? In Julien's mind, it's over, right? The Germans have won. And actually, remember, Marcel tells him this, right? He says, why do you keep on struggling against this idea, Julien? The Germans have won. Accept it, right? That's what Marcel tells him. Right? So this is another thing to keep in mind in Julien's mindset, right? Obviously, the biggest thing that is affecting him with his suicide is the loss of Julia, right? In that he sees that his whole life, everything he's done, because he's not able to protect the one person that he loved and cared about the most, that he sees his life as a failure, right? But there are also all of these other factors that lead him, it seems, to his suicide, right? That he sees that civilization around him, A, is falling because he thinks that the Germans are going to win. B, that he now sees this civilization not as being something that he thought was important and glorious and would ward off evil, but actually is participating in evil. Right? So there are all of these factors that lead Julien to his suicide. And as I said, to me, he seems overstated, right? He's too he's too disillusioned, and understandably so. I mean, if you had just lost the love of your life in this kind of situation, you probably would not be looking on for a silver lining or the good side of things. Right? He becomes too pessimistic, though, about civilization, but we can understand why he might feel this way. Okay. All right, well, since we are out of time, first of all, let me thank you guys for a great semester. I've really enjoyed teaching you these two books. I hope you've enjoyed reading them and analyzing them. And then secondly, remembering that we have the test on Monday. Best of luck with that. If you do need any help or have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. So either for an appointment if you would like to see me in person, or by email if you just want me to look at your plan. Are there any questions about the test before we go, or anything else? No? Okay, well, thank you guys. See you on Monday. Good luck. Have a good weekend, and I will see you then.